All right, we got a lesson this morning I think ought to be encouraging to us. Again, we are looking at a guy by the name of Elijah and some of the things that occurred in his life and some of the things that we're going to see this morning. I want you to know, we think about Elijah and we think about him praying and rain stopping for a period of 3.5 years because he told the king that it's not going to rain until I pray again. And so 3.5 years later, we find Elijah on the mountainside, and we find that whenever he was on the mountainside, that God gave a tremendous victory in his life and in the life of Israel. And then we find that even at that, he runs and he hides, and God took him to a brook and sent the ravens to bring him meat each morning and each evening. And then whenever the brook dried up, he tells him to go to this widow's house. And when he goes to this widow's house, she has nothing more than just enough meal and oil to make a little cake for her and a little cake for her son. And she was out gathering wood so that she could bake it and they could eat it. And then, as she said, then they could die. They had nothing left. But Elijah comes onto the scene, and God had already told Elijah, I've got somebody prepared. I got a widow woman going to take care of you. You go. And Elijah was obedient. He went. When he gets there, he shares with the woman what God had said about taking care of him. God said, fix me a little cake first. And she does that and brings it to him. And he eats the cake. And when she fixes her boy's cake, he has one. And when she fixes hers, she has one. And guess what? There's still meal in the container, and there's still oil. And so she's able to feed herself, her son, and Elijah for I don't know how long, well until the rain come and until God provided a different means of support for her. But we're going to pick up today in a situation that even in God's blessings and even in God's provision, sometimes things happen. And when these things happen, sometimes we don't understand. And sometimes we even go before God and question. And that's what we're going to see Elijah going today. But our lesson's title is Serve Through Prayer. And folks, we need everything we do. This last week we have attempted to serve, and we have done so through prayer. As we continue on, even if we're not having lessons every night for young'uns, and if we're not having bologna sandwiches for young'uns every night, still we need to bathe the efforts of our church, the efforts of our individual daily lives in prayer and supplication before God, because then and only then can they be productive in providing for God those things that He asks us to provide for Him. And God does ask us to provide some things for Him. Now, His provision for us is everything. The very breath of life He provides. But He looks at us and says, I want something that you can do. And young'uns, every one of us has something we can do. We were saved for a purpose and for a reason. God didn't save us in a haphazard way. He has a purpose for each one of us and a reason for us. And so we're going to see that this widow woman, God had a purpose and a reason for her being. She was going to sustain the prophet. This prophet had a purpose and reason for being. He stood against the prophets of Baal and against all the things, all the ungodliness of Israel. And so we now find that at this time, another situation arises. He's living there where this widow woman is, where this widow woman can bake him a cake of bread and he can have something to eat. This widow woman has her food and her son's food. And so we find that everything's going along pretty good until what? Seems like, if you're like I am, everything's going along pretty good until... And then seems like everything goes all to pieces. Everything starts going backwards. You ever have times like that when everything's going along pretty good, and then all of a sudden, wham, things start going backwards. And before you get turned around good, many things are going backwards. And you wonder sometimes, Lord, what happened? One of the first things come to your mind, what I do or what didn't I do? Because really and truly, you go back and study about Job. That's the first thing Job did. Job questioned himself and his children before he did anything else. He checked up on himself, and he could find nothing in his life that would have brought upon him the circumstances that were occurring. And Job went through circumstances far beyond what we normally do. But what was Job's response in it? The Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And so that's the way we should be. Everything we've got is a blessing God's bestowed upon us. Our health is a blessing that God's bestowed upon us. Our ability to go and come is a blessing that God has bestowed upon us. And if he chooses for some reason to back away from any one of those blessings, it's his to do. Because I'm his, you're his. And that's the attitude we need to have. I belong to the Lord. And really and truly belonging to the Lord means that I am here for him. What does he need out of my life? What does he need out of me to accomplish? And sometimes some of the things that are needful and necessary for me to accomplish the will of God are not always pleasant to my flesh. My flesh recoils at a lot of things that God would say to me, but, in the Spirit. What did he say about his disciples? He took them into the garden and asked them to pray with him. And what did they do? They went to sleep. Well, it was getting on into the wee hours of the morning, don't you think? They were tired. They'd been up going all day, and they were tired. But when he come back to him, he told them, said, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And folks, our flesh is weak sometimes. We're looking in 1 Kings chapter 17, verses 17 through 24. And as we begin this, we see that after these, and it came to pass after these things, is what verse 17 begins with. And this is after Elijah has come to the widow woman. This is after he has been there with her for, I don't know exactly how long, but everything has been going along pretty good. And everything was going along at least peacefully. But something occurred when we get to verse 17 that changes all that. Things go all to pieces. And quite honestly, the woman, because she has been obedient to God, no doubt questions. And Elijah, because he had been obedient to God, doesn't understand what's happening. How many times do we not understand God's will in our life? How many times do we not understand why God lets this or that happen to us? More often than not, I dare say. But it says in verse 17, and it came to pass after these things that the son of the woman, the mistress of the house, fell sick, and his sickness was so sore that there was no breath left in him. That's a very polite way of saying he died. This boy, this woman's son, who had been eating heavenly bread, because folks, really and truly, don't you reckon that's where the bread that come out of that little container, that meal that was there, that never did run out, didn't it have to come out of heaven? That oil, didn't it have to come out of heaven? So he'd been eating heavenly bread at God's provision, at God's care, and yet he falls sick, and his sickness is such that the breath of life leaves him. And this woman automatically, she knows Elijah's the prophet. She knows that Elijah is God's representative. She knows Elijah is really and truly the hope that she had. Without Elijah, she wouldn't have been having this heavenly bread. Without Elijah, she wouldn't have been able to have eaten all this time. But notice what she says to him in verse 18. And she said unto Elijah, what have I to do with thee, O thou man of God? Art thou come unto me to call my sin to remembrance and to slay my son? This woman lived in this region, and this region was a place where the worship of Baal was tantamount. That was the god of the land. That was the god of the region. That was the god of the town. That was the god of this woman's family. And so now this man of God has come, and she recognizes that he is a man of God and recognizes that he represents that one true God. And so he's come, and she has been blessed at his coming because of her obedience. And you notice that because of her obedience and faith, she's been being taken care of. Well, young'uns, sometimes because of our obedience and our faith, God's taking care of us, and then calamity befalls. And this woman looks at Elijah and says, "O thou man of God, why did you come to me? Why did you bring me to a point where I was being blessed by God's presence because of my offering to Him of the bread that I had? You brought me into this situation. I was out of this situation. I was in the world, but you come into my life. And when you come into my life, things changed." But she also says, "Art thou come unto me to call my sin to remembrance? I know what I am. I know what I was. I know my condition. And now my sorrow is such that my sin," and folks, listen, sin has consequences. And a lot of times we associate the consequences with just our physical life. But the consequences of sin are not just in this physical life, they are in eternity. We will be judged one day for our sin. You and I as Christians will stand before the Lord, and we will give an account of our life. Every idle word, every idle deed, folks, we're going to stand before Him and give an account. I'm just thankful that in standing before Him, I don't stand before Him condemned, because there is therefore now no condemnation to them that are in Christ Jesus. Because I'm saved, I'm not condemned to eternity in the pits of hell, but I still have to answer some questions to Him. And this woman says, "You've come into my life, and now I realize what I was. I realize how unworthy I am in the service of God. I realize that I'm not good enough." And young'uns, a lot of times in our lives, our spiritual lives, we feel that I'm not good enough, I'm not clean enough, I'm not worthy enough, and so I deserve this. And that's kind of where this woman is when her son dies. This is this is the consequence. This is the result. But listen, she had been trying to serve God, hadn't she? She had been rendering to God that which she was directed to do. She had been doing what God said for her to do, and now her son is dead. Who does she blame? She blames Elijah. And let me tell you, wasn't that kind of understandable? Because God hadn't intervened into her life until Elijah come into her life. And she had been being blessed in her life because Elijah was in her life. But she also recognized that, hey, I'm a sinner. And the consequences of my sin is, you brought it to my attention because you're a man of God. And now my son is dead. Is this what it's all about? And I want you to know something. Elijah, I think maybe is taken aback just a little bit, because everything he'd been minding God, hadn't he? Didn't he mind God when he went to the cave where God told him to go? Didn't he mind God whenever he waited each morning and each evening on the ravens to bring him his food? He trusted God for the brook to supply him the water. But when the water dried up in the brook, he trusted God because God said, "You go to this widow woman. I've told her to take care of you." So he's been being obedient. But all of a sudden, calamity comes into his area of life. This woman comes to him and says, "O thou man of God, did you bring this on me? Did you bring me to the point where I knew about your God so that I would see my sin and I would see my unworthiness? And now because of that, my son is dead." And Elijah said unto her, "Give me thy son." Now, folks, I'm here to tell you that in itself is making a tremendous request to this woman, because this boy is all she's got. She's a widow. All she's got is this boy. And Elijah looks at her and says, "Give me your son. The lifeless body of your son, the last thing that you have, give him to me." Now, Elijah apparently at this point doesn't know exactly what to do, how to do, but he knows to take every situation before God. You know what he knows? So he's going to take this boy, this dead, lifeless boy, and he's going to take him before God. Because he don't understand, God, I'm doing what you told me to do, and look what calamity is happening around me. What calamity is happening in this woman's life? She's been good to me. She's taken care of me. She's provided me with food, and just because you told her to, she's been doing these things. And so he says, give me your son, and he took him out of her bosom, and carried him up into a loft where he abode, and laid him upon his own bed. He took him to himself. And young'uns, I want you to know something. That is something we need to remember as Christians. Other people's hurts and other people's wounds and other people's calamities, we need to have compassion. We need to be able to have that empathy to where we can feel for them when they're going through some of these things. And it's important. We're living in a world now that has none of that. Really and truly, the world goes on, and if you're having problems, the world goes on and just doesn't even bother to wave out the window at you. It just goes on. Elijah stopped. Elijah took her son, laid him on his own bed. But I want you to notice what Elijah does next. Elijah knows that God's the only answer that there is. Elijah knows that God is the only one that knows the whys, the wherefores. God is the only source of an answer to this problem. And so he takes this boy and he takes him into the loft where he lived and laid him on his own bed, and he cried unto the Lord in verse number 20. He comes before him. He has that boy's body laying on his bed where he slept of a night. This boy's body is lifeless. There's no breath of life in it. This boy's mama is downstairs weeping. Probably he could hear her sobs even as he lays the lifeless body out on his cot. And what does he do? He cried unto the Lord and said, O Lord my God, hast thou also brought evil upon the widow with whom I sojourn by slaying her son? God, I don't understand. I can't understand. This woman was doing what she could to help me. This woman was working to take care of me. This woman was giving me of her sustenance that you provided for her. This woman was doing what she knew to do. And you have allowed this to happen? Now, folks, I want you to know something. Life happens, and sometimes God chooses not to intervene in life. There's a lot of things that I bring on myself, and God chooses not to keep me from suffering the consequences of. There's a lot of things that we bring on ourselves, and God doesn't say, well, wait a minute, I'm not going to. Listen, if you see your young'un playing with a yellow jacket's nest, you're going to grab your young'un and pull it back, aren't you? You're not going to let it get stung if you can help it. How many times have you told your young'uns are running through the grass in their big bare feet, and you tell them, hey, you better put your shoes on or you're going to get stung. We try to protect them. Well, God protects his children, but a lot of times we run ahead. Have you ever done that? Or has your young'uns ever done it? Run ahead of you, and first thing you know, they are crying because they got hurt. I don't know exactly whether or not this woman had run ahead. I don't know anything about that, but I know this much. God had allowed this woman's son to die, to get sick and die. Elijah doesn't understand it. How many times have I had to tell somebody that I don't understand why God lets things like this happen? I don't understand why you are having to go through this. And youngest, a lot of times we don't, do we? You think about it. A lot of times, why am I suffering? Or why is this? Have you ever seen somebody that you just hold to a very high level because they have been somebody that you look up to as a spiritual mentor, and then you see the hurt and the pain coming into their life, and you say, God, why? If there's any good people anywhere, that's good people, and they're suffering. Well, Elijah comes before God, and he cried unto him, and he says, Lord my God, hast thou also brought evil upon the widow with whom I sojourn. Now God is not the author of evil, but God does allow bad things to happen to good people. But he has a purpose and he has a reason. And he stretched himself upon the child 3 times and cried unto the Lord and said, O Lord my God, I pray thee, I ask, let this child's soul come unto him again. 3 times. He didn't give up when he prayed once. He didn't give up when he prayed twice. He went back the 3rd time and prayed and asked God. What does the Bible tell us? We have not because we ask not. Isn't that what it says? Well, I want you to know something. Sometimes we have to want it bad enough to ask for it again. Sometimes we have to want it bad enough. Our heart has to be so set upon it that we come back the 3rd time and say, God, would you? And that's what Elijah did. Because Elijah couldn't see rhyme or reason what's going on. And he couldn't understand why God had allowed this. And he knows that God can fix it. Do you know that God can fix whatever's going on that's wrong in your life? A lot of times I know that he can, but I don't expect him to because I don't deserve it. And that's kind of where the woman was. I kind of believe that's kind of where she was. She realizes I don't deserve it. And I'm going to suffer because of it. Well, folks, I don't really think God really wants us to suffer any more than we have to in this world, because that's the reason he's got a place fixed where there is no suffering. He don't like to see us suffer. But a lot of times we need to be serious enough with God to where we come back and ask him again. And come back and ask him again. Elijah asked him, and on the 3rd time, God answers. Did God hear Elijah the first time he prayed? He did. I believe that with all my heart. But listen, whenever God allows anything in our life, no matter what it is, whether or not we understand it, whether or not we comprehend it, doesn't matter what it is, God allows things in our life for a purpose and for a reason. And sometimes it's to grow us. Sometimes it's to get us closer to him. Sometimes it's to bring us face to face with what we really, really want from him. And whenever we come to that point, then God will answer that prayer. And also I believe this, the prayers of a righteous man availeth much. You know what the book of James says? Our prayers can change situations in our lives. Our prayers can change situation in our families. Our prayers can make all the difference in the world. And so we find that he prays, and on the 3rd time, he prayed. What did he ask? And listen, he asked a very specific thing, didn't he? He asked for God to allow this child's soul to come unto him again. And folks, I want you to know something. He's asking him to give life back to a lifeless body. God has the authority to do that. There's nothing too hard for God. But in verse 22 it says, And the Lord heard the voice of Elijah, and the soul of the child came unto him again, and he revived. I don't know how much time passed from the time that the woman first caught him up to her bosom, because it says that Elijah took the boy out of her bosom. She was there holding and weeping over her son. I don't know how much time elapsed from the time that the boy quit breathing to the time that Elijah prayed that 3rd time. But I want you to know the boy was dead. The woman knew the boy was dead. Elijah knew the boy was dead. But it did not stop Elijah from believing that God could do the impossible. So when he prayed that 3rd time, God heard, and the soul of the child came unto him again, and he revived. And Elijah took the child and brought him down out of the chamber into the house, and delivered him unto his mother. And Elijah said, See, thy son liveth. The testimony is that God can take care of all situations. God can cure the hurt, the pain, the suffering. God can undo the weeping and the wailing that this woman was going through. See, thy son liveth, by the grace of God, by the mercy of God. And young ones, we need to make sure that whenever prayers are answered, that we acknowledge where the answer comes from. This last week and week before, we have seen prayers answered out of our church prayer life, have we not? I mean, Cole, David and Glenda's grandson, was with us last week. And quite honestly, the first part of the week when I looked at him, he was still looking pretty pale. By the end of the week, he's got a little color to him. And his daddy says he's eating like crazy. And but he's still, recovering. But folks, listen, the doctors had said that really and truly they didn't know if the boy was going to live. And he's up and running again. We have others, that same situation where really and truly it didn't look like there was going to be any victory at all. And yet God brought a victory out of each one of those things. Where did it come? See, thy son liveth. Why? Because you trusted it to God. Because we prayed. Because we asked God. And the woman said to Elijah, now by this I know that thou art a man of God. Now if you go back to the first accusation that she put at him, she called him a man of God, didn't she? But listen, she says, and she said unto Elijah, what have I to do with thee, O thou man of God? But over here she says, now by this I know that thou art a man of God. You do have that connection. You come to me as a man that I didn't know, as a man that I didn't really, know anything about. You come to me, and in the name of God, you told me to do what you told me to do. I responded to it. And listen, God proves himself by answering prayer, doesn't he? Doesn't he prove himself by answering prayers? What should that do to our prayer life? What should that do to our faith when God answers prayers? It ought to increase it. This woman says, by this I know that thou art a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in thy mouth is what? Truth. I know that the God that you told me about, the God that you have walked before me in, is truth. He is the one true God. Folks, that's what God wants to do in the world around about us, is bring to pass the reality of the fact that he is God and there is none other. Our world is dabbling with all kinds of false gods. Our world is dabbling with all kinds of different religions. But there is but one true God. And the way we walk before them and the way that we share with them is what's going to prove to this world that the God that you and I serve is the one true God. Listen, before Elijah took him up on the mountain, the people were worshiping Baal, and they were having a good time doing it. And they were being offered all kinds of things out of the worship of Baal. But whenever God showed them by power, by the flame coming down out of heaven and eating that sacrifice up, they turned from that worship of the false god to the worship of the one true God. And then we come down to this one woman, one widow woman, was important enough to God that he sent Elijah into her life so that this one woman could know. And I know that the word of the Lord in thy mouth, that you are. Folks, we stand approved of God when the world sees Jesus in us. We need to make sure that we show them Jesus. Elijah did that, and Elijah shared with them, and Elijah gave them these things. So I want to encourage you to think about that and pray. But pray, and folks, listen, as you serve, make sure that you pray about the service that you render. Elijah was serving God by doing what he said. Circumstances around him, he still served God by prayer. And prayer changes all things. All right, I think that's pretty much what I got this morning. I encourage you to look up. He's coming, and when he comes, guess what? We get to go home. But until then, we got to do like Elijah. Take the circumstances that we don't understand, walk in them with the knowledge that God's got it under control. No doubt about it. Appreciate you this morning.